She was abandoned by the river, her cries swallowed by the wind, her body left to freeze beneath the endless sky. No one was meant to find her there, but fate had other plans. A cowboy rode into her silence, his horse cutting through the storm, his eyes catching the sight of a life barely hanging on. He could have turned away, just like the rest of the world had, but something in her brokenness called to the loneliness in him. And in that moment, two souls on the edge of giving up would collide, forever changing the course of their lives. The river carried no mercy that day. Its surface shimmered with the late sun, gold where the light touched and black where the current bent deep. On its banks, where reeds bent and mud clung to bare skin, a woman lay still. Her name was Eliza, though no one was there to speak it aloud. Her shawl, once pale, was streaked with dust and torn at the edges. Bruises bloomed along her arms like dark flowers. The men who left her here had not looked back. Her lips moved faintly, but no sound carried across the water. Perhaps a prayer. Perhaps a goodbye. The sky leaned low, full of heat and silence, as though the earth itself had paused to decide whether she would be taken or spared. She thought of her husband's grave, the soil still raw over it, and wondered if she would soon join him beneath. A tremor of hooves came through the ground before she saw him. At first she thought it thunder, though no cloud had gathered. Dust rose along the far bend, and out of it rode a figure. A man, tall in the saddle, hat brim cutting across the sun, his shoulders heavy as if he bore more than the weight of gear and rifle. He slowed when he saw her. His horse snorted, stamping once as though warning of danger. Thomas Hale dismounted without a word. He was not the kind of man who wasted speech. Lines cut his face where the sun had burned and healed it too many times. One eye bore the faintest scar at its corner, the mark of a fight long past. He looked at her not with pity, nor alarm, but with the stillness of a man who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. Eliza tried to turn her face from him, ashamed of her weakness, of the torn dress, of being found in the dirt like refuse. But she could not move. A sound left her throat, rough and cracked. Thomas bent, lifting her as though she weighed less than a bundle of hay. Her head fell against his chest. She caught the scent of leather, smoke, and rain long dried. His arms were firm, unyielding, but not cruel. Without asking, he carried her to the saddle, set her before him, and swung up behind. No words, only the rhythm of hooves carrying her away from the river that had nearly taken her. The ride blurred into fragments, the rasp of his coat against her cheek, the sway of the horse, the slow return of air to her lungs. She wanted to ask him why. Why? He bothered. Why a stranger would turn aside for her, but her voice betrayed her. So she stayed silent, and he did not press. Perhaps silence was safer for them both. By the time they reached town, dusk had gathered. Smoke curled from chimneys, children's laughter carried faintly, doors shut with the sound of evening settling in. Yet when Thomas rode in with the half-conscious woman in his arms, the street stilled, faces turned. Men paused on their porches, pipes in hand. Women at wells drew back their buckets with sudden interest in anything but the rider. Whispers ran swifter than wind through wheat. Who is she? Where'd he find her? Trouble, that's what she is. Eliza felt every gaze pierce her more sharply than the sunburn across her skin. She wanted to vanish back into the river, to escape the weight of their suspicion. Shame prickled her neck, as though she were guilty of some sin she could not name. Thomas ignored them all. His eyes stayed ahead, his hand steady on the reins. He guided the horse through the hush as though the stairs meant nothing. Yet Eliza saw the muscle shift in his jaw, the faint tightening that betrayed he noticed every whisper, every glance. At the livery he dismounted, then gathered her into his arms again. He carried her past the blacksmith's fire, past the general store where shutters banged shut. When he reached the edge of town, he turned down a path that led not to the saloon nor the boarding house, but to a cabin that stood apart, half shielded by cottonwoods. The door creaked open with his boot. Inside, the room smelled of ash and cedar, of years lived in solitude. A rocking chair sat angled toward the hearth, though no flame burned in it now. Tools hung on the wall, oiled but unused. On a shelf, a tin cup sat beside a folded kerchief, the fabric faded by time. Thomas laid her on a narrow bed against the wall. His hands, rough as rope, moved with surprising care. He poured water into a basin, soaked a cloth, and set it against her brow. Still no words. Only the scrape of chair legs as he sat beside her, watching. Eliza opened her eyes once, briefly. The lamplight caught the planes of his face. He did not look away, nor did he offer false comfort. His silence was steady as stone, as though he promised only this. She was no longer alone at the riverbank, but even in his shelter she felt the burn of the town stairs. She could almost hear them still, their judgments carried on the night wind. She had been saved, yes, but not welcomed. In that moment she realized something bitter and sharp. Sometimes salvation came wordless, but safety did not mean belonging. She closed her eyes against the truth, the sound of river water still in her ears. The days that followed passed in a quiet that was almost unbearable. Thomas Hale's cabin stood apart from town, a mile or so down a dirt track, close enough that smoke from the saloon's chimney could sometimes be seen, but far enough that the silence pressed hard at dusk. Eliza remained within those walls, her body mending but her spirit restless. Each morning she rose stiff and sore, wrapping herself in the same torn shawl, ashamed of its ragged edges yet unwilling to ask for another. Thomas left her food, bread, beans, sometimes a strip of venison, and though he spoke little, she noticed he always made sure her portion was larger than his own. It was not his silence that unsettled her, silence she had known all her life. It was the weight within it. His quiet did not feel empty. It felt crowded, as though ghosts lived in it. Brushing their cold fingers along the walls of the cabin, she began to notice them in objects. A rocking chair stood near the hearth, polished smooth by years of use, but now it remained motionless, the fire's glow never catching a living figure upon it. On a high shelf, a tin cup had not been touched in years. In the shed, tools lay, rusting in the corner, spades, saws, a hammer with its handle worn thin. They spoke of labor once done with vigor, then abandoned. The strangest discovery came when Eliza, searching for a quilt, opened a trunk at the foot of the bed. Inside lay a folded dress, its lace yellowing with time, a wedding dress. She lifted it with careful hands, tracing the seams, the places where a needle had once pierced white fabric with care. It was not hers, yet she felt its weight as though it belonged to her burden too. She set it back gently, but her mind did not let it rest. That night, as the fire flickered low, she watched Thomas's profile in the lamplight. His eyes stayed fixed on the hearth, though he seemed not to see it. His hand lay open on his knee, scarred, unmoving. She wondered what woman had once worn that dress, what laughter had filled this room before silence claimed it. Her own ghost did not let her rest either. Sleep dragged her into dreams of the river, black water pulling at her ankles, her husband's face hovering just beyond reach. His eyes in memory were not kind. They were cold, narrowed, hardened by bitterness. She woke gasping, clutching at her shawl as though it could shield her from betrayal's sting. Whispers carried from town reached her too. Thomas returned some evenings with supplies, and she could tell by the way his jaw tightened, the way he left his hat longer on his head than usual, that the people had been talking. Once, when he thought she slept, she overheard him mutter, "They say you're cursed, woman. Say I'm a fool to keep you here." Her breath caught, but she did not move. In her heart, she knew the whispers. They had followed her since girlhood. Her mother's bloodline traced back to a people the town distrusted, though her father had been a settler through and through. To some, that made her neither one thing nor the other, a woman marked by suspicion. Now, with her husband gone and her body left at the mercy of cruel men, the whispers sharpened into blades. Yet each morning she rose and forced herself to braid her hair. It was not vanity but defiance. Her mother had taught her the braid as a way of keeping dignity close, no matter how the world sought to unravel her. Each twist of hair was an act of claiming herself, of saying she had not drowned in the river, nor in their judgment. Thomas noticed. Once when she bent to gather wood, She caught his eyes on the braid hanging over her shoulder. He said nothing, only looked away, but in that moment she felt less invisible. Still, the cabin's silence pressed. Down. She longed to speak, to ask him about the dress, about the rocking chair, about why he had lifted her from the river when he could have ridden past. But her tongue stayed still. To break his silence too soon felt like breaking fragile glass. It might shatter something she could never piece together. One evening, rain fell soft against the roof. She sat near the hearth, mending the hem of her dress with thread Thomas had quietly left on the table. He sat across the room, oiling the rifle. He carried everywhere. The lamplight caught on the barrel, on the fine lines of his face. She thought again of the woman who had once lived here, of the wedding dress folded away, and wondered if Thomas carried her ghost as heavy as Eliza carried her own. The realization came slow, like dawn across frost. Healing would not come from silence alone. It would come from facing the shadows, his and hers. The ghosts in the cabin were not hers to erase, but she could choose not to let her own consume her. Each braid, each stitch, each breath was proof that she lived still, even in the weight of their watching. As the rain tapped steady against the wood, she lifted her eyes. For the first time, she let them meet Thomas's without flinching. He held her gaze a moment longer than usual, then lowered it again. It was a small thing, but in that moment she felt less like a burden left to die by the river, and more like a soul allowed to remain in the world. The silence remained. But now, it carried the faintest thread of something else. Not just grief, not just ghosts, but the fragile beginning of endurance. The storm rose sudden without warning. All day the sky had been a dull gray, heavy with unshed rain, and by nightfall it broke open with fury. Rain lashed the prairie in hard sheets, rattling the shutters of Thomas Hale's cabin and hissing against the firewood stacked by the door. Wind pressed its weight through the cracks, carrying the smell of wet earth and far-off lightning. Inside, Eliza sat close to the hearth, shawl pulled tight across her shoulders. Each thunderclap shook her bones. The river still lived in her memory, and the storm's roar reminded her of that endless current tugging at her ankles. She stitched slowly at a tear in her sleeve, though her hands trembled with each strike of light. Thomas paced the floor. His boots thudded against the wood, steady but restless. In his hands the rifle gleamed each time the lamp flame bent. He checked its chamber, then checked again, his silence sharper than the wind outside. It was near midnight when another sound broke the storm. A knocking. Not timid, but deliberate. Eliza startled, the needle pricking her finger. Blood rose in a bright bead. She looked at Thomas, but he had already raised the rifle, his jaw tightening. Another knock followed, louder. Then a voice, low but clear, carried through the rain. "Open. I bring medicine." Thomas hesitated. His hand on the latch trembled in a way that belied his steady stance. At last he pulled the door wide. A figure stood there, rain dripping from a cloak, braid dark and heavy with water. She could not have been more than 20, yet her eyes carried the gravity of years. Ayanna, a woman of the nearby settlement. In her hands, wrapped in cloth, she held herbs, small vials, the scent of cedar and willow bark rising from them. Thomas's face hardened, not with anger, but with wariness carved deep. He said nothing. The rifle remained in his hand. Ayanna did not flinch. She stepped inside with the grace of someone who knew she had a right to stand where she did. Rain pooled at her feet as she laid the bundle on the table. "For her," she said simply, nodding toward Eliza. Eliza's breath caught. She had not expected kindness from a stranger, let alone one the town whispered against. With cautious fingers, she reached forward, brushing Ayanna's hand as she accepted the cloth. It was warm, despite the storm. For the first time in weeks, Eliza felt her throat loosen, gratitude breaking through her fear. "Thank you," she whispered. Ayanna gave the faintest smile, then her expression grew grave. "The men who left you by the river," she said, her voice like stone against the storm. "They may come again. Some say no woman should survive what you did." I thought you should know. Eliza's heart stilled. She clutched the shawl closer, the fire's warmth no longer enough to keep the cold from her bones. Thomas's voice broke the silence at last, deep and edged. How do you know this? Because men talk, Ayanna replied, meeting his gaze without fear. And because I listen. The room thickened with tension. Rain beat the roof harder. Thunder shook the walls, but it was the silence between them that pressed most heavily. Thomas's grip on the rifle tightened. I don't trust the words of your people, he muttered. Not after what's been taken from me. Eliza's eyes flicked to him. It was the first time she had heard anger in his voice. She wanted to speak, to stop the bitterness spilling into the room, but her tongue failed her. Ayanna did not bristle. She only tilted her head, the braid sliding across her shoulder. I did not come to ask for trust, only to give warning. Another thunderclap rattled the windows. In the flicker of lamplight, Thomas's face softened, the hardness faltering. He lowered the rifle, though he did not set it aside. His voice dropped, almost weary. My wife and child were lost to raiders years ago, burned out of our home, while I was away. Since then I carry my silence and my rifle, for I have nothing else. Eliza felt her chest tighten. So that was the ghost that haunted the rocking chair, the folded wedding dress. Ayanna's eyes did not waver. Pain is not carried by one people alone, she said softly. It lives in us all. The words hung in the air, heavy but true. The fire hissed as a drop of rain found its way through the roof. Eliza, trembling still, reached out. This time not to the medicine, but to Ayanna's hand. Her fingers curled around the young woman, steady despite her shaking. It was a small gesture, but it bridged a chasm wider than words. Thomas watched. His eyes flicked from their hands to the storm outside, then back again. His jaw worked, as though he wanted to protest, but no sound came. At last he turned away, staring into the fire as if it might swallow his grief whole. They sat through the storm together, Thomas by the window, rifle across his knees. Eliza at the hearth, clutching, the medicine with one hand and Ayanna's with the other. Outside the wind roared like the voices of old wars. But inside there was only the crackle of fire and the faint, steady rhythm of 3 breaths refusing to break. When dawn bled gray into the sky, the storm began to fade. Rain slowed, thunder drifted far into the hills. Ayanna rose, pulling her cloak tight. Her braid swung behind her, heavy and sure, like a promise carried into the day. Eliza stood, shawl slipping from her shoulders. Will you come again? She asked, her voice fragile but hopeful. Ayanna's dark eyes held hers. If you need me. With that she stepped into the wet morning, vanishing into the mist like a shadow returned to earth. Thomas watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. But Eliza felt something shift in the silence. An unspoken truth that even divides, carved deep by grief, could perhaps be crossed. And with that fragile thought she turned back to the fire, clutching her braid as though it were a lifeline. The days stretched into weeks, marked not by anything dramatic, but by the ordinary rhythm of life that seemed almost unbearable in its quietness. Eliza would rise before the rooster crowed, her hands raw with work that was both foreign and familiar. She knew how to keep a fire going, how to mend a shirt with steady stitches, how to fetch water and carry it without spilling a drop. But here, beneath Thomas's roof, it all felt different. Each act felt borrowed, like she was tending to a life that did not belong to her, wearing a role she was never meant to claim. Thomas, for his part, moved through the days like a man with a burden chained to his chest. He was careful with her, too careful. He would thank her in a voice that was steady but clipped, his eyes never quite holding hers. At times she would catch him standing in the doorway with that faraway look, his hand pressed to the wood frame as though steadying himself against thoughts he dared not entertain. The house itself seemed to shrink with every passing day. Its silence grew heavier, the wooden beams creaking louder, the clock ticking harder. Eliza began to notice how he avoided certain things, The rocking chair by the hearth sat untouched, as though the memory of someone else had claimed it. He never lingered at the table after meals, never sat with her long enough for words to spill into comfort. And when his eyes did flicker her way, they did so briefly, like a man glancing toward a flame he could not risk standing too close to. She felt the loneliness sharpen, not from being alone but from being near him. Proximity did not soothe the ache, it made it worse. To live in the same air, to walk the same floorboards, to hear his boots scuff against the same dirt, and yet feel him miles away, it was a kind of torture that left her chest heavy at night, when she lay on the narrow bed he had given her. One evening, the tension that had grown between them revealed itself in the smallest of ways. Eliza had brewed coffee the way he liked it, dark and strong. The smell filled the kitchen, bitter and warm. She poured it into the tin cup and carried it to him at the table. He was seated, his head lowered over the ledger where he kept tallies of the ranch, the cattle, the feed, the expenses he bore alone. She set the cup down with a quiet clink against the wood. His hand moved at the same time as hers, reaching for the handle just as she was steadying it. For a single heartbeat, their fingers touched, skin against skin. A shock of warmth shot through her, not just in her hand, but through her whole body, sudden and dizzying. She felt her breath catch, her lips parting with words she could not form. His eyes lifted to hers in that instant, wide and startled. She saw it there, the same spark, the same awareness, the same dangerous truth that she had been trying to bury beneath chores and silence. But almost as quickly, it was gone. He pulled his hand back as though burned, his jaw tightening, his gaze dropping. The cup rattled softly as it settled fully onto the table. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. But there was something frayed in it, something that did not sound like gratitude at all, but rather regret. She stood frozen for a moment, her hand still hovering in the space between them. Then she withdrew it, folding it into her apron, holding it against her stomach as though to still the tremor that shook her. The air felt different after that, thicker, charged. She busied herself with the stove, though there was nothing to tend. She rearranged the jars on the shelf, though they were already neat. Anything to keep from looking at him, from giving in to the pull that her heart begged her to follow. Later that night, when the lamps were blown out and the house dipped into shadows, Eliza lay awake listening to the sound of his footsteps across the floorboards. He was pacing. She could hear the hesitation in each step, the pauses, the turns. She imagined him standing in the dark, wrestling with the same war she was fighting. She bit her lip until it nearly bled, trying to keep the ache of it from breaking her chest in two. She had known abandonment, cruelty, silence from men who had never seen her heart. But this was different. This was the nearness of love she dared not name, a closeness that threatened to undo her if she reached for it. It was not rejection that hurt, but restraint, not indifference, but the weight of a feeling too dangerous to speak. Thomas, in his own room, leaned against the wall, his fists pressed to the wood as though it alone could keep him standing. He had seen the light in her eyes when their hands touched. He had felt the rush, the way it could have pulled him straight into her arms if he hadn't stepped back. And it terrified him. He had made vows once. He had buried a wife. He had built walls around his heart, not out of pride, but survival. To let them fall now, to let this woman close, felt like betrayal of a ghost he still loved. The house grew smaller each day. The walls pressed tighter. The silence pressed heavier. And beneath the roof they shared, something tender and suffocating grew, like a flame hidden inside a lantern, glowing, alive, desperate to break free, but kept behind glass. Eliza lay awake, with her hand curled against her chest, whispering words no one could hear. Proximity does not erase loneliness. It sharpens it. And sometimes the cruelest ache is not in being abandoned, but in being seen, almost touched, and then left untouched. Again. The first heavy snow fell in silence. By morning, the cabin looked half-swallowed, its roofline sagging under the weight. Each time Thomas pushed the door open, A spill of white tumbled across the threshold, clinging to his boots as though it meant to drag him back outside. Winter had come hard with no apology. Inside, though, a different kind of season began. Eliza, who had once sat hollow-eyed and still as stone, now moved with a fragile determination. She found a needle and thread among Thomas's few supplies and began to stitch torn seams in her dress. Her voice, at first no louder than the crackle of kindling, began to hum broken melodies. Half songs she remembered from girlhood, half prayers she hadn't known she was still carrying. Thomas would sit in the corner after long rides, leaning his rifle against the wall, watching her hands move in the firelight. He never interrupted, not even when the lullabies trembled and fell apart in her throat. It was enough that sound was returning to the cabin, a human sound that wasn't just the hollow wind scraping the shutters. The days blurred into one another, measured only by the feeding of horses and the laying of wood across the hearth. Nights were harder. The storms pressed down with a suffocating weight, rattling the cabin until every nail seemed to groan. In those hours, when cold slithered through the cracks, Eliza would draw her shawl tighter, sitting close to the fire as though it were the only living thing left in the world. Thomas noticed how she braided her hair with steadier hands now, no longer shaking, no longer broken entirely. Something had returned to her, not joy, not yet, but the quiet muscle of survival. He admired it silently, not daring to speak what stirred in him whenever her profile caught the glow of the flames. It was on such a night, when snow buried the horizon and the world seemed reduced to that one fragile cabin, that Thomas finally broke the silence that had lived between them longer than either could measure. "Eliza," he said, his voice low, weighted. She looked up, startled at the way his tone carried a tremor he usually mastered with ease. "I ride," he began, staring into the flames as though they alone could hear him. "I ride further and harder than sense allows. Every storm, every empty plain. Not because I expect to find anything out there, but because if I stop, if I let the quiet close in, death feels nearer than I can bear." The words came haltingly, but once spoken, they could not be taken back. His jaw worked, his hands restless, as though he'd revealed a shame he had sworn never to share. Eliza did not answer at first. The fire cracked. Shadows shifted along the walls like restless spirits. She saw him differently in that moment. Not only the rescuer who had cut her bonds, not only the rider who defied cold and cruelty to keep her alive, but a man who carried his own wilderness inside him. "Saving me," she whispered, her voice threading through the storm's howl outside. "That gave you something to ride for." He lifted his eyes, and for the first time since they had met, they held nothing back. Grief, weariness, but beneath it, a flicker that was not entirely despair. "It gave me purpose I thought was long gone," he admitted. His hand moved then, almost of its own will, across the space between them. It stopped halfway, hovering as though fear might yet pull it back. Eliza did not hesitate. She placed her hand into his, their fingers tangling in a clasp not of hunger, but of anchoring. The fire's glow deepened, painting their joined hands in gold. No passion consumed the moment. No hurried words broke it. Instead, what passed between them was quieter, heavier, more binding than desire. It was a vow unspoken yet fully understood. Two wounded souls deciding, in that breath of silence, to keep each other alive. Her head bowed slightly and a tear slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow but from a strange kind of relief. Thomas reached with his free hand, rough thumb brushing it away before it fell further. His touch was clumsy, unpracticed in gentleness, yet it steadied her in ways she could not explain. The storm rattled harder against the walls, but for once neither of them flinched. They sat like that, side by side, as if the cabin itself had grown stronger for their closeness. When at last Eliza spoke, her voice carried no tremor. "Then let us guard one another," she said. "Through winter, through whatever waits." Thomas nodded, his hand tightening around hers, a promise forged not in ceremony, but in firelight. Outside, the snow raged on. Inside, two lives once, broken and scattered, found the faintest beginning of something whole, and the fire between them burned steadier than the storm. The dawn came pale and heavy, the kind of gray light that carried no promise of warmth. A thin fog clung low over the fields, stretching across the meadow like a shroud. The quiet was broken only by the clatter of horse hooves and the creak of wagon wheels gathering on the road outside Thomas's farm. Eliza heard them before she saw them. She was at the window, shawl wrapped tight against her shoulders, her breath fogging the glass as she looked out. Men were coming, neighbors. Some she recognized from the church pews, some from the market. Faces that once nodded to her with neighborly politeness now looked set like flint, rifles glinting in their hands. "They've come," she whispered, her voice flat but steady. Thomas set down the rifle he had been cleaning and crossed to her side. He looked past her shoulder through the glass, jaw tightening. "They mean to finish what the river didn't." Eliza turned, searching his face. For days she had felt the weight of her shame pressed against her chest like a stone. But in this moment, something shifted. No part of her wanted to run, to shrink, or to let others decide her fate again. She pulled the shawl closer and lifted her chin. "Then let them look at me." Thomas's eyes softened. Without a word, he picked up his rifle and walked to the porch. The wood groaned beneath his boots as he stepped out into the cold morning, the barrel of his gun angled toward the dirt, though ready to rise if the need came. Eliza followed, the hem of her dress brushing over the threshold as she stood beside him. The men stopped a few yards from the porch. Their leader, a broad man, with a red face and sharp eyes, spat into the dirt before speaking. "You know why we're here, Thomas," he said. His voice carried the rough edge of authority, the kind that belonged to men who believed the land was theirs to control. "That woman don't belong here. She brought disgrace to this town, and now she hides behind your roof. We won't allow it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The rifles lifted higher. Thomas raised his own weapon, steady as stone. "You'll have to step through me first." The man's mouth twisted into a sneer. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We don't want your blood, just hers." Eliza felt the eyes of the crowd burning into her, but she did not flinch. Her shawl clung to her shoulders like armor. She took a single step forward so that her voice, when it rose, could not be mistaken for anything less than certain. "You left me by the river," she said, her voice carrying over the gathering. "You thought I'd vanish into the water like a sin washed away. But I lived, and I will not hide anymore. If you think you can shame me again, you'll have to do it in the open, before God and before those who choose to stand beside me." Her words struck the crowd like stones in a pond, sending ripples of unease through their ranks. Some looked down, others shifted uneasily as though ashamed to meet her gaze. And then, movement. From the tree line beyond the field, horses emerged. Ayanna rode at the front, her dark braids catching the pale light, her expression unreadable, but strong. Behind her came her people, mounted and silent, forming a line along the edge of the farm. They carried no rifles at the ready, but the message was clear enough. Eliza was not alone. The men at the porch faltered. The leader glanced back at his companions, looking for their fire, but it was already dimming. One by one, the townsfolk lowered their guns. No man wanted to be the first to test his courage against two lines of resolve: the rifle of Thomas, the steady presence of Eliza, and the silent strength of Ayanna's riders. The leader spat again, though now it sounded hollow. "This ain't over," he muttered, Thomas's rifle leveled higher, cold and unwavering. "It is." The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of saddles as the townsfolk began to turn away, their anger dissolving into something quieter, smaller: shame. They had come expecting a spectacle of punishment. Instead, they found themselves dismissed, their claim rejected not with blood, but with a refusal to bow. When the last wagon rattled back down the road, Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The fog began to lift with the sun, thinning like smoke after a fire. Ayanna dismounted and approached the porch, her people waiting behind her. She looked at Eliza, then at Thomas, her eyes calm. "They will not return soon," she said softly. Thomas lowered his rifle. You came anyway. Ayana's mouth curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile. No one stands alone. Eliza's throat tightened. She bowed her head in gratitude, unable to find words, but Ayana nodded as if she understood the silence. Then she turned, mounted again, and with her people disappeared back into the trees as quietly as they had come. The farmyard was still. Thomas set his rifle aside and walked to the stable. He saddled his horse with steady hands, then turned to Eliza. It's time. Eliza hesitated only a moment before stepping toward him. He extended his hand and she took it, letting him lift her onto the saddle behind him. Her arms slid around his waist, not as one clinging for protection, but as one who had chosen her place. The horse started forward, hooves striking rhythm against the dirt. The horizon stretched ahead, painted gold now with the rising sun. Behind them the farm stood quiet, a place of survival. Ahead the road bent toward something else, something that felt almost like home. The river flashed in her memory, its cold pull, its merciless current. But as Eliza pressed closer against Thomas's back, she knew she would never return to that place again, not in body, not in spirit. Dignity had not been given to her. Love had not been granted like a gift. Both had been reclaimed, fought for, and chosen. And now, riding side by side with the man who refused to let her vanish, Eliza realized the truth. She was no longer a shadow of who she'd been. She was alive, and she was whole, and she was finally on her way home.